So if we already have a shrinking workforce, the question is, can we afford to lose any more people when we Brexit? And with those concerns in mind, the government commissioned an organisation called the Migration Advisory Committee, or the MAC for short, to prepare a report on what the impact of Brexit would be on our labour market and what recommendations they could make for a post-Brexit immigration system that would allow the UK to continue to operate and function. Now, they gave them until September of this year to publish that report, and unfortunately that sat uncomfortably close to the deadline that the government had for reporting their plans for immigration post-Brexit. So in March we had a sneak peek at the MAC's findings. They published an interim report. And the findings of that interim report really showed that employers were still very concerned about Brexit and the impact it would have on their ability to recruit staff. One of the key things that they were concerned about particularly was their ability to recruit low-skilled staff. So they were concerned in particular that there was a bit of a perception that perhaps they were targeting EU nationals. They wanted to recruit EU nationals over UK-based candidates. And they said, well, that's really not the case. What we find in practice is that EU nationals either are the preferred candidate because they have the skills that the UK-based candidate doesn't have, but also we find that EU nationals are more productive, more reliable. They're prepared to do the jobs that UK nationals aren't going to do, whether that's because they have unsociable hours or they are working in conditions that aren't particularly favourable. And so they were very concerned that actually, quite apart from whether they were targeting EU nationals or not, if they aren't able to recruit EU nationals, they won't be able to fill those positions from the UK labour market. The other big concern that they reported was a concern that if they had to bring EU migrants in through the current immigration system in the UK, it would become incredibly difficult for them to fill these skills gaps. So anybody in the room who's dealt with the Tier 2 immigration system, has anyone prepared to confess to it? In the UK, if you want to bring skilled labour from overseas, you have to become what's called a licensed sponsor under Tier 2. So you have to fill in a very lengthy application form, you have to provide lots of supporting documents, you have to pay a fee to become a licensed sponsor, and then once you've gotten over that hurdle, you have to then sponsor the individual, which might mean applying to the Home Office for permission to sponsor them. You have to pay fees to be able to employ them while they're in the UK, and they also have to apply for a visa themselves. So there are lots of fees, lots of time, lots of effort involved in bringing someone from overseas through that route. Now, at the moment, EU migrants aren't subject to that scheme, but if they're going to be subject to that scheme post-Brexit, employers were very concerned that that would make employing EU migrants very difficult, and they weren't looking forward to having to do that. So after those interim findings, I think there was quite a lot of speculation about what a post-Brexit immigration system might look like. There was talk about maybe having some sort of preferential system for EU migrants that would make it easier for employers to carry on employing EU migrants in these positions. There was talk about maybe having a system that would allow low-skilled workers into the UK more easily. And at the moment, there is a route to the UK called Tier 3 low-skilled route, and it's always been closed because there's never been a belief that you need to bring people from overseas to do low-skilled roles in the UK. But there was some consideration about whether they might open that tier as well. But actually, we had, just a couple of weeks ago, we had the final report from the MAC, and they haven't actually gone with either of those two options. So the MAC has given a number of recommendations about what they think a post-Brexit immigration system should look like. The first thing they said is that they think higher skilled migrants should be given preferential routes to the UK. So they don't want to close down the ability of employers to bring high skilled, or what they're calling medium skilled workers to the UK. But they don't think there should be any sort of preferential route for low skilled workers. What they have talked about, and this is what employers were dreading, is actually using the Tier 2 route to the UK as being the route to bring EU workers in. Now, at the moment, there's a cap on the number of people who can come to the UK via the Tier 2 route. They can only bring 20,700 people per year to the UK through that route. And you might have seen in the press a few months ago, the monthly cap was hit. I think it was about 3 months in a row, and it prevented them from bringing in doctors to come and work in the NHS. So as you can see, that cap is already pretty stretched anyway. If we're now bringing EU workers in through that system, it's going to be even more stretched. And so you can understand why employers are thinking, well, we'll never get people in on that basis. But the MAC have recommended that cap is completely scrapped, and that rather than looking at numerical values as to how you bring people in, you look at what skills they're offering and whether we need them in the UK, which all seems very sensible. They've talked about reducing the skill threshold, so rather than just having people who have degrees come into the UK under that route, you might have people with a slightly lower qualification. And they're also trying to advocate for them to remove what's called the resident labour market test. So at the moment, if you want to bring people to the UK from overseas, you have to go through an advertising process and prove that you really can't recruit from the UK labour market. They're saying that actually that shouldn't happen, and that rather they should look at what jobs really can't be filled at the moment and make sure that those are on a list for people to select from when they make their application. The difficulty with the Max proposal is they're not proposing to cut what is the current salary threshold for bringing people in through the Tier 2 route. So at the moment, if you want to bring somebody in through that route, you have to pay them at least £30,000 per annum, and quite often it's a bit more than that because it's job specific. They aren't advocating that that's scrapped, and the reason that's proved quite controversial is for people for businesses that are experiencing difficulties in recruiting into low skilled positions, they're very unlikely to be paying those people £30,000 or more to come and work for them. So even though they may have the opportunity to bring them in through this Tier 2 route, actually in practice they'll never really be able to do it. So what we've seen just this week, the Road Haulage Association have called the plan ignorant and elitist. The construction sector have come out. I mean, there are 120,000 EU migrants currently in the construction sector, and the construction sector body, the Federation of Master Builders, have come out and said, well, that's fine, but if you want people coming in and laying bricks and doing carpentry and all of that sort of work, there's no way they're going to get into the country if that's the salary threshold. People working in the restaurant industry have said they're going to have to scale back if these proposals are put into effect. In the food manufacturing sector, the hospitality sector, domestic services, one in five individuals are migrant workers, and they've said that if this is put in, it'll effectively put a stop to the way that they employ people at the moment. And in the care sector, there's a real concern as well, because at the moment, the care sector is quite heavily populated with EU nationals working at the moment. And over the next few years, they're expecting to really need more people in the care sector because there's going to be an increasingly elderly population. So if we are now losing those EU nationals, we're not going to necessarily be able to fill those roles with UK nationals. Who's going to be doing that work? So the government have responded to the Max report, and what they've said is we're not going to say exactly what we're going to do and whether we agree with it, but they do say that they agree that there shouldn't be a preferential route to the UK for EU nationals. So it seems like that opportunity has gone, and actually what we probably are going to end up with is a system a lot like the Tier 2 system, if not the Tier 2 system somehow revamped. We are expecting a white paper. It should come in any time now. It's supposed to be here in the autumn, which I think probably gives them until December. But we should have a white paper through that tells us exactly what the government's plan will be for post-Brexit immigration. But of course, that's all going to be subject to them reaching a deal with the EU. And as we've seen in the papers, that's not looking that promising at the moment either. So circling back round to the question that we originally asked, should we be planning for a workforce crisis? I think it very much depends on who you're asking. I think there'll be some sectors that really are very concerned about this and others who don't think it's going to affect them at all. And I think it will remain to be seen over the coming months what that system is really going to look like and how that's really going to impact on people.